Unless you've been living under a rock or perhaps been in a coma, you know that there's a really big election coming up very soon. In fact, if you drive the roads, at least here in northwestern Pennsylvania, you can't help but see all the signs of people supporting one candidate or another. No doubt if you're on social media, or if you read the news, or if you still get the newspaper, or you tune into the radio or watch the TV, you know that our country is largely divided, politically speaking. And it's no different in the church. In fact, it could very well be that half the people in this church and other churches like it will vote one way and the other half another way. So if we want to understand what politics is supposed to look like for a Christian, we have to begin by understanding what politics actually is. The word politics actually goes back several thousand years, and it's linked to Plato and his understanding of the way that the world worked. And two Greek words, a word for citizens and a word for city, combined together form the word politics. And so there's this blending of city life and the citizens or people of it. In other words, the administration and workings to make that society work the way that it should work. A lot of times when we refer to politics, we think exclusively of the government. And certainly that carries the lion's share of our understanding of politics. But every single organization, even small ones, are political at their very nature. Some of them may not have outstanding features as the government does that resonate and are recognized by us as political apparatus, if you will, but they still are political at their core. And the church is not immune from this. Politics simply means that we have an organization on the way that people operate together, that there are certain leaders and roles that are played, that there are systems in place to carry out things, and there are ways to decide how money is dispensed and used. And so in the church, the politics of the church, if you will, is best described by Paul in the Bible as the body of Christ. And Jesus often refers to his followers as brothers and sisters, or the family of God, members of the kingdom of God. The late great Ravi Zacharias, shortly before his death, penned these words that I believe are important for us to digest as Christians for such a time as this. This is what he wrote. The modern malady in the political arena is one of a fundamental contradiction. There is an unblushing moralizing on politics and a shameless politicizing of morality. Now I understand those are a lot of really big words. So let me break down for you what Ravi Zacharias is really saying in this quote. What he means is that there is this dangerous proposition put out there by lots and lots of folks, Christians included, that they can take morality, something that we learn from God himself through instruction in the Bible, and we can cast it onto politics, and then we use that for our own purposes. Or we can flip that on its head, and we can moralize politics. We can argue one way or the other that this candidate or this view is so far morally superior to something else in contrast. Now, for sure, there are moral issues that are at the core and heart of who God is and what he wants us to be about. But there is no political party and there is no political figure that embodies perfectly, even close to perfectly, all of the issues as they would be deemed best practiced according to Jesus. We moralize politics, governmental politics. When we look for the good things in a political party or in a candidate and ignore the flaws and brokenness that's there. And for sure, not just this election, but every single election that has ever existed, the candidates are always flawed. Terribly flawed, in fact. Who in their right mind would actually want to run to be the highest human power, if you will, in the known world today? And yet I watch this over and over again where people will create this straw man argument, raising their preferred candidate on a pedestal at the expense of basic knowledge that is out there for anyone to discover and learn about that person. We also see the politicizing of morality, where we'll focus on one or two moral issues and ignore all the rest. And the challenge is that no candidate ever in the history of politics in any country, anywhere, anytime has come close to living out a pure moral character like Jesus did. But sadly, that doesn't prevent us from falling into the trap of ignoring the emotional, often stretched, tweaked, and twisted understanding of morality as presented to us by politicians. Now, at this point, you may think that my argument to you today will be that we shouldn't be involved in politics. Christians should just let it be. And the exact opposite is true. There are a lot of people on a practical level who made the ultimate sacrifice so that we have the right to vote, that we have a say in the decisions that are made in our country, the direction that our country will go going forward. But I do caution you, in thinking about politics, that it is not ever going to be the ultimate way in which God's kingdom gets lived out. Unless you're actually a politician or you're linked to a government position, politics is only a part of your world, a slice of the pie, if you will, in which you get to live out your Christian faith. But it is no more than that. It's just a slice. And yet I have read countless times over the last couple of months where people fervently argue, and I believe think in their heart of hearts that one candidate is ultimately going to bring about this mini utopia on earth. And if we're honest, we know that we don't have to look very far, not even outside our own hearts, to know that there's brokenness that abounds in this world. Utopia is not going to be created by any government or any politician. Before we wander too far down the path of politics, let's examine a passage of Scripture that's instructional for us as Christians to understand how we're supposed to look, perhaps, at politics and our faith. If you have a Bible with you today, open up to the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22. That is the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22. We're going to start at the 15th verse today. This is the third of 3 attempts by those in charge in the Jewish world at that time to catch Jesus in a trap. Let's read this account. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. "Teacher," they said, "we know you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by men because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay taxes to Caesar or not?" But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, "You hypocrites! Why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, "Whose portrait is this, and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said to them, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, so they left him and went away. If we want to even begin to understand this passage, we need to put ourselves in the 1st century AD and understand what was inspiring these questions other than the trap that the Pharisees and Herodians were setting for Jesus. In 6 AD, there was a census that took place. And we know that Judas of Galilee, remember Galilee was the area in which Jesus spent most of his public earthly ministry. Judas of Galilee led a revolt against the Roman Empire because as an occupied land, Israel was required to pay tax to the Roman Empire. Now, if you go back into the Old Testament in a number of places, it's clear that the land of Israel was given to the Israelites as a gift from God himself. And so there were a lot of people, a lot of Jewish people, who took this very sorely, that an outside foreign entity was actually trying to obtain taxes from them and requiring them to pay as residents of that land. Judas paid the price with his life to lead that revolt. And so did a number of others with him. And ultimately, they never really won the battle. But what came out of that was a group of people that in large part went by the term zealots. Zealots were Jewish people who were so profoundly convicted about their faith that they were willing to kill others to be able to live out their faith practices. So when Jesus was asked that day the question posed before him, he was really being offered two options: to side with the popular view that the government of Rome should be denied in all aspects, from not paying taxes all the way up to being willing to kill somebody so that the Jewish people could live out their faith in perfection. Or on the flip side of that, to deny them and to embrace the ideals of the Roman Empire. It's really interesting, and not much changes over time, how certain groups of people that would never have anything to do with each other otherwise will join forces when they're trying to bring down a common enemy. And that was the case of the Pharisees and the Herodians. The Pharisees, we know lots about them. They were the devout Jewish people. They were the ones that cared about every little law, written and oral. What started out as a great movement and a return to God turned into a legalistic group of people. That was the Pharisees. The Herodians, on the other hand, well, they were bedfellows with the Roman Empire. They were willing to snuggle up close with the Roman Empire, even to snitch on fellow Jewish people, so that they got kickbacks and places of honorable position in the Roman Empire. And yet, though their backgrounds were completely different, they both wanted to bring Jesus down. And so they posed for Jesus an important question. To be clear, what they're asking Jesus is for him to weigh in theologically on a political issue. Is it right to pay taxes to the Caesar or not? Notice how the Herodians and the Pharisees posed this question to Jesus. It's an either-or question. The answer is either yes or no. Pay taxes or don't pay taxes. And so he rises above the either-or proposition, and he gives them an answer that knocks them flat. He asks to be able to see the coin, the tax coin. Now, there were a couple of kinds of currency in Jesus' day. There was Jewish coinage, and that was used primarily for everyday paying of one another and primarily for paying for the temple tax. But the Roman Empire made its own coins, known as denarii, or denarius in the plural. These were not just units of monetary measure to be able to pay things. They were also political propaganda. On one side of the coins that Jesus would have been handed that day would have been the bust of the Caesar at that time, Caesar Tiberius. And on the other side was an inscription, and it said, Caesar Tiberius Augustus, son of the divine Caesar. In common language today, he was the Son of God. Yes, they actually escalated the emperor to the height of being a deity. And therefore, Tiberius, following in his footsteps, was the Son of God. But here's the thing. Without delay, the Herodians and Pharisees hand this coin right over to Jesus. They've got it in their pocket. They've got it in their satchel. It's right there ready to go, which was a violation of one of the big 10 great commandments given to Moses so long before that, to not have a graven image. It's hard to overstate the impact this would have had when Jesus asked for this coin and is given a Roman coin on the spot. Most devout Jews would only obtain this coin when they had to pay the residential tax. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. They knew what it stood for. And yet here are some of the great leaders of the Israelite nation, and they're carrying around these coins. Jesus has already put them on their heels by asking for this coin and asking, whose image is on this and what inscription do you find? But he's not done yet. Because when they say it's Caesar's, he says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. Literally, what the Greek says is, give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. Because the Caesar had these coins minted, they actually were giving back these coins to their original owner, the Caesar. In making this statement, Jesus accepts, although I would argue based on this passage and several other passages that are similar, that Jesus wasn't a huge proponent of the Roman Empire. He certainly wasn't wholeheartedly embracing the views of the Roman Empire. But clearly, Jesus does affirm, yes, go, pay your taxes. We're called to do that. And the justification for this would have been that all leaders would have been put in their position by God's ordination. That doesn't mean that every single person that comes to power is God's desire. It means that ultimately in salvation history, God is working out His plan. It means that God is working out salvation history in order that ultimately it will culminate with Jesus' return, His judgment of all people, and His rejoining with those who are followers of Him. So rising above the fray, Jesus says, yeah, go ahead, pay your taxes, return the coin back to the Caesar. But then He says this, and give to God what is God's. Though these phrases, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's, are parallel phrases, they certainly are not on the same plane. There is something that rises above all else, and we see that in the very first commandment given of the 10 Commandments. That we should have no other gods before the one true God. God always usurps everything. Give to God what is God's. What is God's? Everything. Everything. And so we see that the government, politics, falls under the working of God, not the other way around. Incidentally, it's important oftentimes when Jesus is asked these testing questions, what He doesn't say, but what He implies, oftentimes is the most important thing. And what is implied here is that, yes, there's an image and an inscription on the coin, and that's of Caesar Tiberius. But each and every single person has the mark or image of God imprinted on their heart. Every single person. And that's true not only for the first century, it's true to this very day. God has given you gifts and abilities and talents and time and energy and health, and it should all be used for His glory. Give it back to God, Jesus says. We're now at a point then that we can make some judgment calls on how we're to understand politics and our role as it relates to the government. First, it's clear that we are to have some kind of involvement with the government. If nothing else, we're called to pay our taxes. Every April 15th rolls around, we're called to pay our taxes. There are mandates and laws that the government hands down to us that we are called to obey unless they violate what God has told us to do. And yes, we have a role to play in who actually represents us in government positions. From local judges to state representatives, all the way up to the highest office in the land, the President of the United States. So yes, we're called to vote, to be involved. I know people who actually argue, I'll never vote. And the reason that I don't vote, these are devout Christians, is because God already knows, preordained what's going to happen. I don't have time to explain that this is actually a misunderstanding of this tightrope found in the Bible of predestination and free will, and that both of them coexist. But I would simply say this: if we applied that principle in all aspects of our lives, we would never plant a seed in the ground and expect something to grow, because God would take care of it. We would never invest time in our family because God would take care of them. We would never show up for work because God will provide. And we know that those are not the way in which God works most of the time. A second thing to ponder: though we have to be careful in making sure that we don't extrapolate out too far from this passage that we've looked at to apply principles all across the board, I think it's fair to say that obviously when we put our focus on the government to ultimately bring about peace, prosperity, and perfection, we're going to be sorely disappointed. Take individual politicians, for example. Not a one of them has been even close to perfection. You look back through some of the greats, historically speaking, in the United States of America. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, JFK, Teddy Roosevelt. All of these leaders were flawed. It doesn't even take that much digging to figure out some of the flaws that they had. Even folks that we would consider to be on the side of justice and doing God's work, people like Martin Luther King Jr. and Susan B. Anthony, were flawed individuals. I've done a lot of reading of history books, of biographies and autobiographies of great historical figures. And the conclusion that I come to every time is that they're no different than us. In fact, politics and the fame and the fortune that comes with it oftentimes just magnifies the issues and sinful behavior in their lives. And this should come as no surprise to us, because we, knowing ourselves like we do, if we're really honest, we know that we're broken and flawed too. And so the danger for us in 2020 is to look at one man in this case and to think that he stands for something that is perfect and good and holy and righteous, while the other one has nothing good whatsoever. The most honest people I meet these days, when looking at the political candidates in front of us, recognize that there is good and bad in all of them. And I challenge you to pray about who God would want you to vote for. But ultimately, what we should seek out is the opportunity to be able to worship God with all of our being, and to be able to love other people, and to advocate for justice for everyone, and to share with others as we're able to do so. See, unless you're a politician or someone who is advocating at a political level for much of your life, politics is just a small sliver of life. You have the ability to have far greater impact by pouring into your family, by working your job with honor and dignity, by living out your faith in all the nooks and crannies of daily living. to tell the truth at all times, to seek justice, to love from the heart, to figure out where we have blind spots and to own them, to acknowledge the sin in our lives, to build community in our neighborhoods, to support those who are less fortunate, to pray for those who are struggling. Elections and the politicians that we put into government positions certainly affect our lives. They can affect our freedoms, the liberties that we have, the ability to do the things that we do or to control certain things that we aren't allowed to do. And so there are real consequences to elections. And so I certainly don't mean to push to the side that politics has no place or role of importance in our lives. It does. Instead, I want to temper some of the fervency that we have about politics with making sure that we're focused on God and His will in our lives. Odds are you have no clue what my political views are. That's because I consciously make the decision, because of my calling as a pastor, to not talk about it. And the reason that I don't talk about it is not because I don't have strong views on the issue of politics. It's because there's a priority. It's more important to me to help people be in right relationship with God than for them to follow after somebody with an R or a D or an I after their name. There's nothing inherently wrong with having a political sign in your yard. But my prayer would be that we would be even more passionate about telling other people about Jesus Christ and bringing hope into the world as we are promoting our candidate. That we would be singing the praises of God far more than we're putting down the other guy. That we would encourage other people to live faithfully for God rather than destroying the arguments that they have for their political views. But ultimately, ask God to lead you in this area of your life. One last thing, you might ask, Daryl, why in the world are you standing in this dumpy old building, 2x4s exposed, sawdust on the floor, wires hanging everywhere? Because this is the image of what we're called to do every day as followers of Jesus Christ, as Christians. We are called to build a better world, understanding that we'll never experience perfection until Jesus Christ returns and we get to spend all of eternity in the new heaven and the new earth God creates. But in the meantime, we're still called to work for justice and to love boldly and to care about other people and to take time for those who are lonely. I pray that you would make those priorities every single day of your life, because that's what's best for the inhabitants of this community, both the church and the world. God bless you as you look to God as your Lord and Savior.